In this gripping story, Marcus, a successful black software engineer, is wrongfully accused of trespassing at his own apartment complex simply because of his race. A woman, suspicious of his presence, demands proof of his residency, despite his calm assurance. Her actions escalate, leading to security being called, all while her bias and assumptions are on full display. The situation, marked by microaggressions and blatant racism, sparks tension among the residents, exposing deep-rooted prejudices. Marcus is forced to face these injustices while maintaining his composure, knowing the stakes are higher than just this one confrontation. The sun dipped low behind the skyline of downtown Atlanta, casting long shadows across the streets. Marcus Johnson, a 38-year-old CEO of a rapidly growing tech firm, sat on the balcony of his condo overlooking the city. He'd spent his life building the city's vibrant pulse. A mix of old Southern charm and fast-paced urban progress spoke to him like an old friend. It was a place that had both nurtured and tested him, but now, from the comfort of his high-rise, it was hard to remember the struggle it had taken to get here. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the glass of bourbon in his hand, catching the last rays of the evening light. He was dressed in a simple black t-shirt and well-worn jeans, his posture relaxed, completely at odds with the powerful figure he had become in the corporate world. In the office, he was commanding, an entrepreneur who had transformed his startup into one of the city's most influential firms, a black man at the helm of a company with multi-million-dollar deals on the table. But here, in the quiet solitude of his home, he was just Marcus. The man who still remembered his mother's voice in his head. Don't ever forget where you came from. Don't forget to stay humble. That humility had carried him through more challenges than most people could ever imagine. Raised in a modest, cramped apartment in an underserved neighborhood, he knew the sting of being underestimated. He'd fought through racism, systemic barriers, and the assumption that his success was somehow unearned. He had grown up hearing that people like him didn't belong at tables meant for the wealthy. And yet, he had shattered those ceilings. Yet, there was always the undercurrent of doubt, the lingering belief from others that no matter how far he climbed, he would always be seen as other. With a sigh, Marcus placed the glass down on the balcony railing. He glanced at the time on his phone and saw that it was nearly 7 p.m. He had promised to meet an old friend for dinner at a new restaurant he had been wanting to try. A place that had recently become the talk of the city for its upscale atmosphere and high-profile clientele. Marcus smiled faintly. The reservation was under his name, but it didn't matter. He had been to enough high-end restaurants, enough charity galas, enough board meetings, that he had learned not to expect recognition or admiration based on his success alone. Still, tonight was a reminder of just how far he had come. The restaurant, Bellini's, stood nestled between two of the city's most fashionable art galleries. Its sleek modern design glinted in the fading sunlight, with expansive glass windows that allowed diners to enjoy a panoramic view of the city streets below. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed, and the air was perfumed with the fragrance of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces. Marcus pushed the door open, a slight, almost imperceptible moment of hesitation passing through his mind. He was used to entering places like this with a quiet confidence, but there was something about the glossy marble floors and meticulously arranged tables that always made him feel like an outsider, despite the fact that his company's name was etched into the glass of countless skyscrapers in the city. The hostess, a young woman with platinum blonde hair and a tight, professional smile, greeted him immediately. "Good evening, sir," she said, scanning the reservation book. "How can I assist you tonight?" "I have a reservation," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "Under Marcus Johnson." She scanned the page again, then glanced up at him. Her eyes briefly flickered over his attire, taking in his simple, well-worn look, before her eyes narrowed. She didn't speak for a beat too long. "I'm sorry," she said, tapping a manicured finger on the book. "I'm not seeing a reservation here." Marcus paused, his patience beginning to wear thin. "It's under my name, Marcus Johnson. I made it just this afternoon." The hostess glanced at him again, but this time, her eyes lingered a little longer. She scanned his features. A tall, broad-shouldered man, with short, closely cropped hair, and an intense gaze, his expression unreadable but not aggressive. She cleared her throat. "Let me check again, sir." She turned toward the back office, and Marcus stood quietly, taking in the surroundings. The patrons inside looked up briefly at him as he stood near the hostess stand, their eyes quickly darting back down to their menus or conversations. He couldn't help but notice how the few black faces in the restaurant were quickly buried in their phones or the food in front of them, as if avoiding attention. The unspoken rule of the place was clear: the black man standing in front of them didn't fit the image of a regular. The hostess returned after a long minute, a forced smile still clinging to her face. "I'm so sorry, sir, but it seems there's been a mix-up. We don't have a reservation under your name after all." She glanced at the paper again, then back at him. "But perhaps you'd like to have a seat at the bar while we resolve this." Marcus's brow furrowed. "I don't want to sit at the bar," he said, the words coming out more firmly than he had intended. "I'm here for my reservation under Marcus Johnson." The woman shifted uncomfortably. "I can check with the manager," she said, but it was clear her tone had taken on an edge of irritation now. "Please do," Marcus replied calmly, though the pit in his stomach was growing. He had been here before. The subtle microaggressions that came with being a black man in a wealthy world had always been the same. The doubt, the hesitation, the subtle questioning of his right to occupy space. He had learned to ignore it, to rise above it, but something about tonight felt different. A moment later, the manager, a middle-aged man in a sleek suit, appeared, his posture stiff and professional. "Good evening, sir. I understand you're having an issue with your reservation?" "Yes," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "I made a reservation under the name Marcus Johnson this afternoon, and I've been told there's no reservation under my name." The manager glanced at the hostess, who avoided his gaze, her face red. He then turned back to Marcus with a practiced, polite smile. "I apologize, sir. It seems there may have been an error. If you'll just wait a moment, I'm sure we can resolve it quickly." Marcus remained silent as the manager disappeared into the back office. The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier by the second, and for a moment, Marcus felt the weight of all the times he had been made to wait, to prove, to convince someone that he belonged. In those moments of quiet tension, he couldn't help but think of his mother. She had always told him that no matter how successful he became, people would always judge him by the color of his skin before they ever saw the work he put in. Even now, after all the deals, the companies, the millions in the bank, he was still the one asked to prove his worth. The manager returned a few minutes later, his expression slightly more strained. "I apologize again, sir," he said, speaking with a formality that felt rehearsed. "It seems there was a mix-up on our end. Your reservation is confirmed for tomorrow night. Not tonight. Would you like to reschedule?" Marcus stood silent for a moment, his gaze steady. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, their curiosity palpable. "No," Marcus said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "I won't reschedule. You'll have a table ready for me tonight, or I'll be leaving." The manager hesitated for a long moment, caught between trying to save face and doing what he knew was right. A few seconds stretched into eternity before he nodded curtly. "Right away, sir. Please follow me." As Marcus walked toward his table, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. They had tried to dismiss him, to make him wait, but he knew his worth, and tonight, he would make sure they knew it too. He wasn't just a black man in a fancy restaurant. He was Marcus Johnson, the man who had earned his place at every table, and tonight, he would claim it. The manager, after some hesitation, led Marcus to a table tucked in the far corner of the restaurant, far from the other patrons, away from the bustling crowd. He had been given no explanation, but it was clear. The decision to seat him here wasn't because of a mistake. This was deliberate. Marcus sat down, fighting the frustration rising in his chest. He had seen this treatment before. The subtle differences in how he was treated, no matter how successful he became. He couldn't change how he looked, and apparently, neither could the world change how it perceived him. A few moments later, the waiter arrived, his smile a little too wide, his eyes slightly too nervous. It wasn't lost on Marcus that the waiter's gaze flicked nervously to the manager every time he spoke, as if checking for permission. "Good evening, sir. Can I start you off with a drink?" the waiter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, maintaining his calm. "I'll have a bourbon, neat." The waiter scribbled down the order, but there was a hesitation before he walked away, the kind of pause that suggested he was unsure of how to treat the man sitting at the table. Marcus could see it all. The inner struggle, the unspoken rules of the room that had somehow turned him into an outsider, despite his obvious place in society. As the waiter disappeared, Marcus couldn't help but glance around the room. He noticed the subtle looks from nearby patrons, their whispered conversations quiet but undeniably directed at him. Some tried to hide it, others didn't even bother. He had become a spectacle in the midst of his own success, and it felt like a joke. "Don't let them get to you," Marcus muttered under his breath. His mother's voice echoed in his mind again. "Stay dignified, stay calm. Your worth isn't defined by how they see you. It's defined by what you've done and who you are." But it wasn't easy. The waiter returned with the drink, his hands unsteady, as he placed the glass in front of Marcus. "Here you go," he said, his voice still low, as if unsure of whether or not he was allowed to make eye contact. "Thanks," Marcus replied, his voice controlled. He took a slow sip of the bourbon, trying to center himself, but the underlying tension gnawed at him. It wasn't just the small acts of prejudice that had started to creep in. It was the very fact that he was constantly reminded that, no matter how much he achieved, he would always be looked at differently. Marcus felt his phone buzz on the table. He picked it up to see a message from his assistant. "Reminder. The charity gala starts in an hour. Don't forget to bring your speech." He sighed, the weight of the upcoming event suddenly feeling like an anchor. The same speech he had delivered dozens of times over the years, filled with carefully crafted words on equality, opportunity, and empowerment. Words that, tonight, seemed more like an irony than a motivation. At that moment, his phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from social media. Someone had tagged him in a post, and when he opened it, he saw a video circulating. A video of the incident at the poolside earlier today. His stomach churned as he saw the image of the woman accusing him of trespassing, the security guard's hesitance, the whispered glances from bystanders, and his calm, collected response. It was already going viral. The waiter returned once more to check on him. "Is everything all right?" he asked. But this time his voice lacked even the nervousness of before. It was like he had slipped into autopilot, carrying out his duties as if Marcus were just another customer to be dealt with. "Fine," Marcus said curtly. He didn't have the energy to engage in small talk or make polite conversation with someone who had already made up their mind about him. But the waiter's next words caught him off guard. "You know," the waiter began, glancing around nervously before leaning in slightly, "it's not the first time people have complained about you being here." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" The waiter stiffened and quickly backpedaled. "I mean, people just say, you don't look like you belong. It's just, they say..." Marcus cut him off, his tone icy now. "You're saying people think I don't belong here because of the color of my skin?" The waiter looked mortified. "I didn't... No, I just mean it's... Well, you're here for the first time, and it's a high-end place." "Right," Marcus replied, his voice barely controlled now. "It's always about the skin, isn't it? Even when you've earned your place." The waiter stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Finally, after an awkward silence, he stammered, "I'll leave you to it." He quickly backed away, leaving Marcus alone again in the corner of the restaurant. Marcus's heart was racing now, the simmering anger building up inside him. It wasn't just the woman at the pool earlier, or the nervous waiter now. It was the constant reminder, the constant undermining of his presence, that people, regardless of his status or his wealth, would still see him as an outsider, as if his achievements weren't enough to afford him the right to occupy a seat at any table. As the tension in the room escalated, Marcus felt his mind wandering to what had happened at Magnolia Creek. The interactions had been uncomfortable to say the least, but now, as he sat here, in a restaurant he had every right to be in, he realized that this was a systemic issue. It wasn't just isolated incidents or isolated individuals, it was something deeper, something that ran through the very fabric of the places he had worked so hard to be a part of. In the midst of these thoughts, he noticed the familiar figure of Eleanor, the woman from the pool, entering the restaurant with a group of her friends. Marcus watched as she passed the hostess, offering a small smile and a wave, as she was seated at a table near the front of the room. It hit him then, the weight of the invisible barriers that had always existed between people like Eleanor and him, the assumptions that still stood between them, no matter how much he achieved. Eleanor caught his eye as she was seated, and for a split second, he saw something in her gaze, a flicker of recognition. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by an uncomfortable glance down at the menu in front of her. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just the quick, dismissive glance that had become so familiar over the years. Marcus leaned back in his seat, trying to keep his frustration in check. This wasn't just about the confrontation at the pool, or the subtle jabs from the staff. This was about a world that constantly found ways to remind him that no matter how far he went, the door was never fully open. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen. This time, it was a message from his best friend, Michael. Saw the video. You handled that well. I'm proud of you. We need to talk soon. You good? Marcus read the message and smiled faintly. The support from his friend was reassuring, but it also reminded him of the growing attention the incident was getting. The video had gone viral, and now he was more than just Marcus Johnson, the CEO. He was Marcus Johnson, the black man who was harassed at his own apartment complex. A deep breath in, and then a steady exhale. He would deal with the fallout in due time. For now, he needed to focus on what had brought him here. The mission he had been working on for years, to bring about systemic change, to break down the barriers and challenge the prejudices that lingered in every corner of society. But as the restaurant buzzed with murmurs and side glances, as the pain of being constantly underestimated and seen as an outsider tightened his chest, Marcus realized that his work had only just begun. The restaurant's atmosphere grew heavier, as Marcus sat there, surrounded by hushed whispers and knowing looks. The phone buzzed again in his hand, this time with an alert from social media. The video of his encounter at the pool had taken on a life of its own. It was everywhere, on news websites, Twitter, Instagram, and even the local news. Marcus couldn't avoid it anymore. The image of his calm demeanor in the face of unwarranted prejudice was now plastered across screens everywhere, alongside the hashtag, Justice for Marcus. His stomach tightened. The attention wasn't something he'd sought. He had hoped to put the whole thing behind him. But now, it had spiraled into something bigger, and the storm was only just beginning to gather strength. With every passing minute, the noise of the restaurant grew louder, as if the building itself was reacting to the pressure. The waiter who had approached him earlier was now nowhere to be found, replaced by a manager who clearly had been alerted to the situation. His steps were measured, but there was a stiffness in his posture that spoke volumes. "Mr. Johnson, I need to speak with you," the manager said, his voice low, as he gestured toward a side office. Marcus didn't need to be asked twice. He set his drink down, and with a steady breath, followed the manager, every step a reminder of how this simple dinner had turned into a spectacle. The weight of eyes on him was palpable as he passed, but he refused to acknowledge it. They could look all they wanted. He was done being a spectator in his own life. Inside the office, the manager closed the door behind him with a click, his eyes nervous as he locked them on Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, first of all, I'd like to apologize for what happened at the pool," the manager began. "We've reviewed the footage and it's clear there was a misunderstanding. However, there are also some concerns about the situation escalating." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He could feel the tension building, like an electric current running through the room. "Escalating?" he repeated, his voice calm but sharp. "I wasn't the one escalating anything. A woman came to me, accused me of trespassing in my own building, and then called security. The only thing that escalated was the way I was treated, because of how I look." The manager shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped in front of him. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you that this is not the stance of the complex. We're a community here, and we don't tolerate discrimination of any kind. But there are also other residents to consider. Some feel uncomfortable with, well, the attention this incident is bringing." Marcus could feel his heart race, the words cutting deeper than he expected. "So, what you're saying is that I'm the problem, that me sitting at a pool I'm paying to use is what's causing discomfort? Because some people feel uncomfortable. They feel uncomfortable because I exist, because of how I look. The manager swallowed. It's not about you personally, Mr. Johnson. It's about the situation. It's about making sure all our residents feel safe and welcome. A laugh escaped Marcus, low and bitter. Safe from what, me? The manager was visibly taken aback. He stammered for a moment before speaking again. I don't mean to say it like that, but the issue here is that some people have made assumptions based on, well, your appearance, and that has caused tension. People don't always know how to react, and some residents are concerned. A sharp silence settled in the room. Marcus's gaze grew steely. He stood up, towering over the smaller man, the weight of his success and dignity pressing down like an invisible force. The issue isn't my appearance. The issue is the bias and the assumptions people make based on how I look. The fact that I'm black, and that's all they see. It doesn't matter how much I've achieved, what I've done, the moment I'm seen, they make assumptions. This isn't just about a misunderstanding. It's about people who believe they have the right to define who belongs and who doesn't, based on their own ignorance. The manager seemed to shrink under Marcus's gaze, his discomfort growing more apparent by the second. I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson, but what do you want us to do about it? Marcus stood motionless for a moment, his eyes flicking to the door before returning to the manager. He could feel the weight of the choice he had to make, the decision to stand firm or let the injustice pass. But Marcus had long ago stopped letting things pass. The fire inside him had only grown with each setback, each slight, each reminder that the world would never fully accept him. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again, Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. I want a public apology, not just from that woman, but from this entire complex. And I want people here to know that this is unacceptable. If you can't make that happen, then I'll make sure the story gets out. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here. The manager hesitated, and Marcus could see the calculation in his eyes, but the decision was already made. He wasn't going to back down. Finally, the manager nodded, though his expression was tight. I'll speak with upper management and see what we can do, but you need to understand that this is a delicate situation. Marcus shook his head. It's not delicate. It's about what's right and what's wrong. If you don't handle it right, you'll have more problems than just this one. Marcus turned toward the door, feeling the weight of the conversation settle on his shoulders. He could feel his resolve solidifying with each step he took. The world wasn't going to change if people didn't stand up. He wasn't going to let this go. He would make sure that this moment, this unjust treatment, would be the catalyst for change. Just as he reached for the door, there was a knock. The manager opened the door slowly, a new figure standing in the doorway. Mitchell, a lawyer who had been working with Marcus on corporate projects for months. His sharp eyes met Marcus's in that instant, and he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Marcus, we need to talk, Mitchell said, his voice urgent. I've been getting calls all day. The situation's bigger than you think. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mitchell glanced back toward the manager, then spoke in a quieter voice. The video. It's viral. And there are people asking questions, not just about the complex, but about the bigger picture. About your company, about your charity, about how you've been treated as a whole. Marcus's stomach dropped. What are they saying? They're calling for answers. They want to know why this keeps happening. They want to know how people like you, successful black men, are still being treated like this, even in places you're supposed to belong. And some people, they're questioning your integrity, your ability to lead. Marcus clenched his jaw, the fury that had been simmering under the surface threatening to boil over. Let them question me, let them ask whatever they want. This is about more than just one person. It's about the entire system that lets this happen. Mitchell nodded. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. It's bigger than the incident. It's about making sure people hear your voice, your company's voice. If you want to stop this, you need to do something more than just address this one issue. You need to stand up, publicly, and use this to push for change. Make people listen. Make them see you for who you really are. Marcus looked at Mitchell, a fire now lighting his eyes. You're right. It's time to act. With one last glance at the manager, who seemed uncomfortable but too terrified to speak, Marcus turned to Mitchell. Get me the media. Get me a platform. I'll tell the world what happened, and I'll make sure they hear me." As Marcus walked out of the office, Mitchell following close behind, he could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on him. The tension was palpable, the weight of the moment thick in the air. The restaurant that had been so quiet and tense now felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. This was the turning point. Marcus had made his decision, and there was no going back. He would fight for what was right, no matter what it cost him. The tension in the air was almost suffocating as Marcus stood before the elevator, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. The viral video had exploded across social media and news outlets, leaving him as the center of a conversation he never asked for. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He had already made up his mind. He was going to speak up, publicly, for what was right. It was time to stand tall. Mitchell stood next to him, his own nerves palpable. He had always been the quieter one in their partnership, preferring to handle legal matters behind the scenes, but this situation had put him in a position where he couldn't hide in the background anymore. "You know this will change everything, right?" Mitchell asked quietly. Marcus glanced over at him, his face set with determination. "I'm not going to let this slide anymore. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who's been pushed to the margins for no reason other than the way they look." The elevator arrived at the lobby of the building, and the two men stepped out into the sunlight. The media swarm outside had only grown stronger. Dozens of reporters stood huddled in front of the building, some with microphones, others with cameras aimed directly at Marcus. The moment he appeared, the barrage of questions began. "Mr. Johnson, do you feel you were unfairly treated?" one reporter shouted. "How do you plan to respond to the people defending the woman in the video?" another called out. Marcus held up a hand, signaling for calm, and the crowd quieted slightly. His chest tightened as he approached the makeshift podium that had been set up for him. This was it, the moment where everything would either change or stay the same. "I didn't ask for this attention," Marcus began, his voice steady, but loud enough to carry across the gathered crowd. "But this is bigger than me. It's bigger than one incident. This is about how, for years, people like me have been treated as less than. Just because of the way we look, no matter how much success we've earned, how much we give back to our communities, how much we've worked to prove ourselves, we're still seen as a threat." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The reporters watched him, hanging on every syllable. Mitchell stood slightly behind him, his hand resting on the briefcase at his side, scanning the crowd with wary eyes. "I'm not the first to be treated like this, and I won't be the last, unless we do something about it," Marcus continued, his eyes shifting from one reporter to another. "I refuse to let this become just another story that fades into the background. This is a conversation we need to keep having. Every single time this happens, we need to speak up. Every time someone is treated unfairly, we need to demand accountability." The words were starting to take hold. Marcus could see it in the faces of the reporters, and in the way a few of the bystanders nodded in agreement. But just as it seemed like the audience was starting to rally behind him, a voice from the crowd cut through. "How do you feel about the woman in the video?" a voice yelled, and Marcus's gaze snapped toward the speaker. Deborah, the woman from the pool incident, had arrived. She stood at the edge of the crowd, a stern expression plastered on her face, her arms folded across her chest. The audience went silent. The reporters exchanged uncertain looks, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Marcus's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. This was the confrontation he'd been expecting. His chest tightened with anger, but he fought to maintain his composure. Deborah stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she approached the podium. "I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I just wanted to make sure the pool area wasn't being misused. Everyone has to follow the rules, right?" Her words were like a slap to Marcus's face. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting for his response. Deborah's arrogance was so palpable, it seemed to hang in the air, suffocating any space for rational thought. He took a deep breath, letting the anger roll off his shoulders. "Rules," Marcus repeated, his voice controlled but firm. "Let's talk about the rules. The rule is that I'm allowed to use the pool I pay for. The rule is that everyone here is supposed to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look or where they come from. But you didn't see that. You saw my skin. And you chose to treat me like I didn't belong. Deborah's expression faltered for just a moment, but it quickly hardened again. That's not what I... You don't get to play the victim here, Deborah. Marcus cut her off, his voice rising slightly, the weight of his words carrying through the silence. You don't get to act like your ignorance is an excuse. You made assumptions, and they were wrong. The truth is, you judged me the moment you saw me, and you decided that I wasn't allowed to be here. You didn't think about the consequences. You didn't think about how many others you've hurt by doing this. The crowd was beginning to stir again, murmurs rising like a tide. Deborah's face reddened with anger and embarrassment, but she refused to back down. Everyone has to follow the rules, she repeated, but the conviction in her voice was waning, replaced by desperation. I'm just trying to protect the community, that's all. Marcus shook his head. Protect the community by creating divisions, by making assumptions based on the color of someone's skin. The crowd erupted into whispers, and Deborah's gaze darted nervously. The reporters had their cameras trained on her now, capturing every word. This was no longer just about Marcus, it was about the system, the biases, the prejudice that had been allowed to persist unchecked for too long. Do you even understand what you've done? Marcus asked, his voice quieter but sharper. This isn't about rules, Deborah. This is about something deeper. This is about how people like me are still seen as threats in spaces where we should feel safe, where we should be welcomed, where we belong. He stepped forward, facing her directly now. The crowd had fallen completely silent. I don't owe you an apology, and I'm not asking for yours, but I'm asking for you to realize what you've done. I'm asking for you to see how your actions have contributed to a system that marginalizes people based on their skin color, their success, or their status. For a moment, Deborah didn't say anything. She stood there, frozen in place, her face a mask of pride and humiliation. And in that silence, the tension reached its peak. The collective breath of the crowd seemed to hold, suspended in the air. Marcus knew this moment was about more than just the confrontation with Deborah. This was about a larger reckoning, about everything that had led him to this point. And it wasn't just about him. It was about the dozens, the hundreds, the thousands of people who had faced the same, or worse. Just then, a voice cut through the silence. An unexpected ally stepping forward. Enough, said Eleanor, the older woman who had defended Marcus at the pool. She stood a few feet away, her stance solid, her eyes fixed on Deborah with a calm authority. This isn't about rules. This is about what's right. And what's right is that we stand up to injustice, no matter where it comes from. The crowd slowly began to stir again, a ripple of agreement spreading. Marcus felt his resolve solidify, his chest swelling with something that felt like power. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This was about everyone, and as Deborah stood there, shamed and unable to respond, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. He wasn't done yet. There was more to be said, more to be done, and more to fight for. The battle for justice wasn't over, but with each step forward, with every word spoken, the tide was slowly turning. The tension in the room was palpable. The confrontation had been building for days, but now, it was time for Marcus to face the woman who had put him through a public ordeal. Deborah had become more than just a symbol of prejudice. She had become the face of the systemic biases Marcus had been battling his entire life. She had assumed that because of the color of his skin, she could control his story, could rewrite his place in the world, but he was done letting people dictate his narrative. It was now, or never. The leasing office had set up a meeting between him, Deborah, and the property manager, Miss Delgado. As he entered the conference room, his eyes quickly found Deborah sitting at the far end of the table, her hands tightly clutching her purse. Her gaze was fixed on the table, avoiding eye contact. The seat across from her seemed too far away, too detached. And yet, in a strange way, Marcus was grateful for the space. Miss Delgado stood up as Marcus entered, her face a mix of professional concern and personal discomfort. She had always been cordial, but today, the situation was different. She had seen the video, heard the community's uproar, and now, she had to handle the fallout. Marcus, she said, her voice soft but firm. Thank you for coming. I know this hasn't been easy for you. Marcus gave a tight smile, walking to the seat, his posture straight. He wasn't here to get sympathy. He was here to get accountability. Let's just get this over with, he replied, his voice steady. Miss Delgado nodded, her expression hardening slightly. She turned to Deborah, who still hadn't lifted her gaze. Deborah, I'm sure you're aware that this behavior has caused quite a stir. This is the second time you've been involved in a situation like this, and it's something we can no longer overlook. This behavior, this assumption that people don't belong based on their appearance, cannot continue. Deborah's eyes flicked up to meet Marcus for the first time. The hatred in her eyes was unmistakable, but her voice trembled as she responded. I was just trying to protect the integrity of the community. I have every right to make sure things are running properly here. No, you don't. Marcus cut her off, his voice sharp with the authority he had built over years of fighting for what was right. You don't have the right to judge anyone based on your own narrow view of the world, and you sure as hell don't have the right to dictate who belongs here or not. Deborah opened her mouth to argue, but Marcus wasn't done. You saw me, he continued, his tone controlled but intense. You saw my skin, my clothes, and you decided I didn't belong. You decided I wasn't worthy of respect, and you had no reason to make that decision other than the fact that I didn't look like everyone else in this complex. The silence that followed was deafening. Deborah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but she didn't speak. Miss Delgado glanced between them, clearly torn. She had seen enough of Deborah's pattern of behavior to know this wasn't an isolated incident. She sighed and looked at Deborah, her voice lowering in disappointment. Deborah, this isn't the first time you've done something like this, is it? Deborah's face reddened, and she looked away, unwilling to answer. But her silence spoke volumes. Miss Delgado continued, her voice growing more authoritative. We've received multiple complaints from residents about your behavior, treating people differently because of their race, their status, or their appearance. This isn't just a misunderstanding, it's harassment, and it's unacceptable. Deborah opened her mouth, but the words faltered. She stood up suddenly, her face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't mean it like that, she said, her voice rising in defense. Marcus leaned forward, cutting her off again. You didn't mean it like that? His voice grew louder, the anger in his chest rising like a storm. You've been calling people suspicious for weeks. I've seen the complaints, I've heard the stories, but you don't care, do you? You don't care about the damage you're doing, because you've convinced yourself that your way is the only way. Deborah was shaking now, her voice no longer carrying the same confidence it had when she first walked into the room. I thought. No, you didn't think, Marcus exploded, standing up. His hands balled into fists, but he didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His words were enough to keep her at bay. You didn't think, because you assumed that people who don't look like you don't belong, and that's a problem that runs so much deeper than you, Deborah. You're part of a system that thinks people like me don't deserve to take up space. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Deborah seemed to grasp the weight of what she had done. She looked around the room, her eyes finally meeting Marcus's with something that resembled regret. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. You don't get to tell me who I am, Marcus continued, his voice calm again, but with an edge of finality. You don't get to define my place in this world. I've worked too hard to get here, to let someone like you take that away. Deborah stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing, struggling to form a response. Miss Delgado finally spoke, her voice firm and final. Deborah, I'm afraid this is more than a simple misunderstanding. You've created a hostile environment, and it's time for consequences. We will be issuing an official warning, and any further incidents will result in termination of your lease. The words felt like a victory, but they were hollow. Marcus had expected more. He wanted more. He wanted Deborah to understand the full extent of her actions, and yet, her failure to own her mistakes made the moment feel incomplete. I won't stand for this, Deborah finally spat, gathering her things in a huff. I'm not the one who's in the wrong here. This is ridiculous. As she stormed out of the room, Marcus felt the weight of her words. She hadn't changed, she wasn't going to change, but something had shifted in the room, something had shifted in him. Miss Delgado turned to Marcus, her expression a mixture of sympathy and resolve. You've done the right thing, she said quietly. This has gone on for too long, but there's still more work to do. People like Deborah won't just disappear because of a warning. Marcus nodded, his jaw set. I know, but it's a start. He had done everything he could in this room, but as the conversation with Miss Delgado continued, Marcus's mind raced. The video was still out there, and it had sparked something far bigger than this one moment. It wasn't over yet. The weight of the world had been set in motion, and now, Marcus had to navigate the next steps. As he walked out of the leasing office, the sun setting behind him, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Eleanor. It's not just about the complex anymore, it's about all of us. Keep pushing. Her words reminded him of what this was really about. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity, he was fighting for the dignity of every person who had ever been judged unfairly. His stand had opened a door, but it was just the beginning. The real work was yet to come. The camera flashed as the reporters began their barrage of questions again. Marcus paused, letting them come to him, knowing full well that the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm about to break. Marcus sat across from Deborah, the woman who had started it all, the one who had judged him based solely on his appearance, assuming his skin color gave her the right to question his place in the world. Today, in this sterile leasing office conference room, it wasn't just about her accusations. It was about a battle for justice, a fight to reclaim his dignity and to confront the biases that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Deborah's eyes flickered between Marcus and Miss Delgado, who sat beside him. She had become visibly smaller since the previous day, now avoiding eye contact with Marcus. She clutched her purse tightly, her fingers white-knuckled around the strap. It was clear she was beginning to realize that this confrontation was bigger than just a misunderstanding. She had been called out in front of the entire community, and now she was being forced to face the reality of her actions. Miss Delgado, Deborah's voice broke the silence. I was just doing my job. I thought I was protecting the complex, keeping things safe. Her words were shaky, defensive, but Marcus could hear the underlying justification in them. She didn't understand. She had never considered that she was part of the problem. Miss Delgado didn't soften her expression, but there was a quiet firmness in her voice as she responded. You have a history of making assumptions, Deborah, and this isn't the first time you've harassed a resident or visitor because of your biases. Your actions aren't just mistakes, they're part of a larger pattern of racial profiling. We've seen it time and time again, and it has to stop. Deborah flinched at the words, racial profiling, and Marcus could see the anger rising in her chest. She wasn't ready to admit she was wrong. She still believed she had the right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. Her entire world was built on the belief that people like Marcus were out of place, that they were the ones who didn't fit. That's not true, Deborah snapped, her face reddening. I've never been a racist. I just couldn't understand why someone like him would be here. He doesn't fit the profile of someone who lives here. Her voice shook, but she was still clinging to her narrative. She was doubling down on her beliefs, even as they crumbled around her. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers, and he could feel the weight of the moment. The anger he had been holding back was threatening to spill over, but he kept it under control. What does someone like him mean to you, Deborah? What does it mean when you say I don't fit the profile? His words were calm, but the edge in his voice cut through the air like a knife. Deborah's eyes flickered away from his, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wasn't used to being questioned like this, not by someone she had already decided didn't deserve her respect. She had never been forced to confront the full weight of her prejudice. People like you, she muttered under her breath, but Marcus caught it. He wasn't going to let her off the hook now. People like me? He repeated, his voice rising, challenging her. Miss Delgado shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly wanting to avoid this confrontation, but knowing it had to happen. Deborah, enough, she said, her voice laced with authority. This has gone far enough. The behavior you've exhibited isn't just rude, it's harmful. It's created an atmosphere of distrust, and it's not something I'm willing to tolerate anymore. For the first time, Deborah's expression faltered. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't deny the facts. She couldn't deny that she had harassed not just Marcus, but countless others who didn't fit her narrow definition of who should belong in the complex. "You've made people uncomfortable," Miss Delgado continued. "And now, you're making excuses instead of owning up to what you've done. Your behavior has been unacceptable, and it's time for you to face the consequences." Marcus couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. This was the moment of reckoning for Deborah, but there was no satisfaction in seeing her so small. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here because people like Deborah had to be held accountable, not just for their actions, but for the toxic system that allowed them to thrive unchecked. "Deborah, this isn't about protecting anyone," Marcus said, his voice steady. "This is about you deciding who belongs here, based solely on your own assumptions. You looked at me, saw someone who didn't fit your idea of who should be in this neighborhood, and you decided I didn't belong." Deborah's face twisted in frustration. She wanted to argue, to dismiss his words, but she could see now that she had lost the battle. There was no coming back from this. Her prejudice had been exposed, and there was no defending it anymore. Miss Delgado stood up, her expression hardening. "You've been warned. I'm issuing a formal complaint on behalf of the residents who've been harmed by your actions. If anything like this happens again, your lease will be terminated. Do you understand?" Deborah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She nodded stiffly, standing up to leave the room. Her shoulders were slumped now, her once confident demeanor completely shattered. Without a word, she walked out of the office, leaving the door open behind her. As the door clicked shut, Marcus let out a slow breath. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and his body was tense, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief. The first battle was over, but he knew the war wasn't won. Deborah's behavior was just the symptom of a much larger issue. Miss Delgado turned to Marcus, her expression softening. "I want to thank you for your patience, Marcus. I know this has been difficult, but you handled it with grace." Marcus didn't smile. There was no time for smiles. "This isn't about grace," he said. "This is about making sure people like her understand that their actions have consequences. It's about showing that we're not just going to sit back and let this kind of thing happen anymore." She nodded in agreement. "You're right. I'll make sure the proper steps are taken to address the community's concerns." As Marcus left the leasing office, the weight of the confrontation began to lift, but a new pressure settled in its place. The video of the incident had already gone viral. It was out there now, and he had become part of a larger conversation about racism, privilege, and accountability. People were watching. What would they say? What would they do? The questions were overwhelming, but Marcus didn't have time to dwell on them. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, family, and even strangers, all offering their support. Some were thankful for how he had handled the situation, others were angry at the injustice he had faced. There were calls for action, for change, and for accountability. It was clear that his actions had started something bigger. The video had sparked conversations, and those conversations were beginning to spread far beyond Magnolia Creek. But as he walked back to his apartment, Marcus felt the quiet weight of uncertainty press down on him. This moment, this small victory, felt good. But what did it mean for the future? What was his role in all of this, now that his story had become part of a much larger narrative? He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. The fight for justice was far from over. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus was ready to fight for it. The following morning, the air felt different. The once tense atmosphere in Magnolia Creek residences had shifted into something that felt like a quiet resolve. Marcus stood at his apartment window, looking out at the complex, trying to process everything that had happened since the incident by the pool. The viral video, the social media comments, the support, and the backlash. It had all happened so fast, yet it felt like it had been weeks since his life had been turned upside down. Today, however, felt different. There was a palpable energy in the air. People had begun to notice the changes. Even the old patterns of mistrust between neighbors seemed to have fractured slightly, as small as those cracks were. Marcus had no illusions. This wasn't the end. But it was the beginning of something. Something that might start with one person taking a stand and ripple outward, sparking the change this community needed. At the leasing office, Miss Delgado had made it clear, the system would hold Deborah accountable. The woman's actions had been laid bare, and while she tried to defend herself, it was too late. The evidence was undeniable: the harassment, the microaggressions. Deborah was no longer just a disgruntled resident, she was a figure of the system that needed to be challenged. Deborah had fled, her reputation shattered. The public reaction to the video ensured that Magnolia Creek would not allow her behavior to go unnoticed. The narrative had already turned in Marcus's favor, and for once, the scales felt balanced, if only for a moment. But the system wasn't one woman. It wasn't just one biased individual. It was bigger than that, and Marcus knew that the fallout from this confrontation would be far-reaching. He couldn't afford to rest on his laurels, he needed to push forward. But he had also learned something about himself in the process. He wasn't just some target anymore, he had become the face of change. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. News outlets began reaching out for interviews. There were requests for public speaking engagements, workshops, and even collaborations with advocacy groups. It was overwhelming, and part of Marcus wanted to retreat. But something inside him refused to let him hide. He couldn't hide, not after everything that had happened. The attention wasn't about him, it was about the fight. It was about showing people that there were consequences for acts of discrimination, and that standing up was the only way to fight back. During his first interview, sitting in front of a camera with a studio crew buzzing around him, Marcus took a deep breath. The host, a well-known talk show personality, smiled warmly as the cameras began rolling. "Marcus, thank you so much for joining us today. Your story is resonating with so many people, and it sparked an important conversation on systemic racism and privilege. How does it feel to know that what you did is changing the way people view this issue?" Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "It feels surreal. I never expected anything like this. Honestly, I just wanted to be left alone, to have a peaceful moment by the pool. What happened after was beyond my control. But now, I see that it's not just about me, it's about everyone who's been treated unfairly because of how they look, or where they come from, or what they have, or don't have." He exhaled slowly. "The real issue is about acknowledging the problem, then confronting it head-on. Change doesn't happen when we stay silent, it happens when we speak up." The host nodded, clearly moved by his words. "And that's exactly what you did. You confronted an injustice in front of your community. Now, you're helping to guide them toward accountability." Marcus gave a small nod. Accountability is key, but it's not just about calling someone out, it's about creating a space where people can learn from their mistakes. We all have biases, but it's up to us to face them, acknowledge them, and make changes. His words were measured, controlled. But internally, he was a storm of conflicting emotions. This wasn't just a conversation about him. This was about the future, about a society that had turned its blind eye for too long. It wasn't enough for him to simply confront his own story. The bigger picture had to be addressed. The community needed to understand that they were all part of a greater fight. That evening, back at Magnolia Creek, the complex had begun to change in subtle but undeniable ways. People had started approaching Marcus, offering smiles, nods of approval, and even heartfelt apologies for the way they had silently witnessed the injustice he had faced. Some had expressed their regrets that they had never said anything, had never stood up before. Eleanor, who had stood up for him at the poolside, had become his unofficial ally in the complex. She had reached out too, offering support and even encouraging him to hold a community gathering, to create an environment where neighbors could come together and speak openly about the changes needed. That idea became a reality within days. Marcus worked with Eleanor and others in the building to organize a gathering, a BBQ for all residents of Magnolia Creek. It wasn't just about food or a social gathering. It was about bringing people together, showing that change was possible when people came together, put their differences aside, and acknowledged their shared humanity. The turnout was overwhelming. Families showed up, kids played in the courtyard, and neighbors who had never spoken before were now sharing stories. Marcus worked the grill with a sense of pride he hadn't expected. It was a small but crucial step in rebuilding the community that had been fractured by prejudice. As he stood at the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with the residents, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. For the first time since that moment by the pool, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. He was surrounded by people who believed in change, who believed in making things better. Not just for themselves, but for everyone. Later that evening, as the sun set and the BBQ wound down, Eleanor approached him, a plate of cookies in hand. "You've done something really special here, Marcus. You've brought people together in a way that hasn't happened in a long time. I'm proud of you." Marcus took the plate, grateful for her unwavering support. "I couldn't have done it without you, Eleanor. You were the first one to stand up. I just gave the situation a little push." Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. "You did more than that. You created a spark that's starting to light a fire. I hope you know that." The next day, Marcus stood outside his apartment, taking a deep breath as he looked out at the complex. He could still feel the weight of the video, the media attention, and the ongoing conversation. The incident had become more than just a personal ordeal. It had sparked a movement, albeit a small one, toward accountability and understanding. He was interrupted by a knock on the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Miss Delgado standing there, holding a stack of papers. "Marcus," she said, "I just wanted to thank you for how you handled everything, and I wanted to offer my support. We're taking further steps here at Magnolia Creek to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. We've already started planning workshops on unconscious bias and how we can build a more inclusive environment. I know it's not enough, but it's a start." Marcus smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you, Miss Delgado. This is exactly what we need. Change has to come from the top down, but it also has to be a community effort. Everyone has to be involved." She nodded. "I agree, and I'm glad we're finally taking the steps to make this place better." As she left, Marcus took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. He wasn't naive enough to think everything had been solved. The work was just beginning. But he had started a conversation that was beginning to change hearts and minds. The power of that change wasn't in one person's victory. It was in the collective effort to rise above prejudice and build something more inclusive. For Marcus, this was just the beginning. There were still battles to be fought, but he had learned that standing up wasn't just about confronting the injustice in front of him. It was about building a future where people no longer had to fight to belong. As the days passed, Marcus continued his work, organizing more community events, meeting with advocates, and speaking at public forums. His name had become a symbol of resilience and change. And though the struggles were far from over, he knew that he wouldn't be standing alone in the future. His community had his back, and together, they would make sure that the story of Magnolia Creek wouldn't just be remembered as an isolated incident, but as a turning point in a larger, more important movement. The days following the BBQ event at Magnolia Creek felt like a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the entire community. He had gone from a man who simply wanted peace by the pool to a leader of change, a symbol of resilience in the face of racial injustice. The journey had been long, at times painful, and filled with uncertainty. But now, standing in the heart of the same community that had once been fractured by division, Marcus realized just how far he had come, and how much farther there was still to go. When he first moved into Magnolia Creek, Marcus never imagined that his quiet life as a software engineer would become the setting for a larger fight. He had built his life with purpose, not just for himself, but to be a positive influence in his community, and yet the world he knew had been shaken by a simple act of discrimination. The poolside confrontation had seemed trivial at first, just an uncomfortable moment, but it had spiraled into something much bigger, and in doing so, it had exposed the very problems that had plagued this country for generations. That woman, Deborah, had seen Marcus as a threat, not because of anything he had done, but because of how he looked. The moment she saw him, she assumed he didn't belong. She assumed that his presence was an anomaly, that someone like him couldn't possibly live in an upscale community like Magnolia Creek. She had reduced him to an outsider, a stereotype, and used her privilege to try and force him to prove his worth. What followed was a show of authority, a security guard summoned, an accusation made. But it was Eleanor's timely intervention that shifted the narrative. For Marcus, that moment marked a crucial change. Before Eleanor stood up, before the video had gone viral, he had been just another black man in a world that often demanded him to explain his existence. But after the video spread, After the world saw the confrontation unfold, Marcus had become more than just a victim of prejudice. He had become a voice, an advocate for those who couldn't stand up or didn't have the courage to do so. In that moment, his calm and measured response was a testament to his inner strength. His ability to stay composed in the face of such blatant disrespect had shown everyone, including himself, what he was capable of. The public response had been overwhelming, both in its support and in the criticisms it provoked. It was a reminder of the pervasive nature of racism and systemic bias in America. For every person who cheered Marcus on, there were those who dismissed him as someone overreacting to a minor misunderstanding. But the truth was that this wasn't about one incident. It was about a pattern, about how people of color, especially black people, were often made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. Whether it was by a pool, at a store, or in the workplace, the experience of being overlooked, underestimated, or outright targeted was all too familiar. For Marcus, the deeper he got into this fight, the more he realized that his battle wasn't just about himself. It was about raising awareness, educating others, and confronting the injustices that had been silently woven into the fabric of society. And while he had become the face of that fight, he knew he couldn't do it alone. That was why his work with the community had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't about him standing up for others. It was about helping others stand up for themselves. The workshops on unconscious bias, the neighborhood meetings, and the public speaking engagements had all become part of his larger mission: to create spaces where people of all backgrounds felt seen and heard. The conversation sparked by the incident had reached beyond Magnolia Creek. People began talking about racial profiling, about the way biases manifest in everyday interactions, and how these actions affect not only individuals, but entire communities. His message had gone viral, but it wasn't just about the recognition. It was about creating a dialogue that was long overdue. The hashtag, #YoCalloutKaren, had been trending, and with it, a growing movement to hold people accountable for their actions, to stop letting prejudice go unchecked. Through all of this, Marcus had also experienced significant personal growth. The anger that had once boiled inside him when confronted by Deborah had shifted. Where there was once frustration, there was now clarity. He had learned to channel his energy into a force for good, understanding that his response, his ability to stay composed, was more than just a display of calm. It was a form of strength, a way to take back control of his own narrative. He had turned what could have been an easy moment of humiliation into a platform for justice. The process of stepping up, of standing firm when the world seemed to demand that he shrink, had allowed him to see his own power. But that power wasn't a destination. It was a journey. There was still work to be done. The injustices that had been brought to light at Magnolia Creek were only a microcosm of the larger issues facing society. Racism, prejudice, and systemic biases were embedded in institutions across the country, and Marcus knew that one viral video wouldn't fix everything. He also knew that the moment he stood up by the poolside wasn't the end of his journey. It was a catalyst, an invitation to continue pushing for change, no matter how uncomfortable the conversations might get. In the aftermath of the event, Marcus had been invited to speak at several events, some local and some national. His voice was one that resonated with people because it came from a place of authenticity. He wasn't just fighting for himself, but for the countless others who had been dismissed, overlooked, or harmed by prejudice. As he prepared for each new speech, each new panel, he carried the weight of all the stories he had heard, the stories of people who had faced similar injustices. He carried the responsibility of not letting those voices be forgotten, and he was determined not to let them fade into the background. The conversations that had started at Magnolia Creek spread to other communities. Soon, other residents were organizing their own discussions about race, bias, and discrimination. The changes Marcus had sparked weren't just internal to his apartment complex. They were building momentum outside its walls, creating ripples in larger communities. It was these conversations, uncomfortable as they were, that would lead to the changes needed to address the root causes of systemic inequality. As Marcus watched his community evolve, he saw how far-reaching his influence had become. The once divided residents of Magnolia Creek were now more united. There was a new sense of belonging, an understanding that difference didn't equal division. When he walked through the halls of the complex, he was no longer seen as an outsider, but as a neighbor, a part of the fabric that made up the community. And the best part was that this wasn't just about him. This was a collective change. But despite all the progress, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. The power of his moment, the way his voice had been heard, was only the beginning. There were still people who refused to see their own biases. There were still systems in place that enabled discrimination. There were still communities where people felt unsafe or unwelcome simply because of their skin color or their background. As he stood in front of another room full of people, talking about the changes that needed to be made, he knew that the most important thing he could do was continue to keep pushing for the kind of world where everyone could sit by the pool, no matter what they looked like, without having to prove they belonged. The work wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it was worth it. And every time Marcus took a step forward, no matter how small, he was making the world a little better. The story of Magnolia Creek wasn't just about one man's fight for justice, it was about a community coming together, realizing that its divisions didn't have to define it. And as Marcus looked out at the world beyond, he knew that the fight wasn't over. But with every new conversation, with every new voice added to the chorus, progress was being made. Slowly, but surely. And that, to Marcus, was worth everything.